Well, a warm welcome from my side to this afternoon's or morning's or late afternoon's webcast around DORA. Before we go into details, I just wanted to quickly give you an introduction to our platform. For those of you that are new, you will see that we have in the lower left-hand corner and on the button modules that give you additional information that you can download and read, hopefully after the webinar. And on the right-hand side corner, you have our Q&A module that allows you to ask questions at any time of our webcast today. If time permits, we will look into them towards the end of the webcast or answer them afterwards if we run out of time. In between, you will see we'll make this a little bit engaging, especially for those of you that just came off from their lunch break. We're going to have some polls that will be pop up where we invite you to provide a quick answer to our poll and questions so that we get this as interactive as it can be in this format. So without any further ado, again, a warm welcome from my side. I'm the host of today's webinar. My name is Christian. I'm the CTO EMEA for Vectra AI, and I'm really looking forward to have an interesting conversation about DORA. I mean, I have to admit, as a father of two, if I Googled it quickly, I think the results yielded in a slightly different direction as what we're talking about today. So we're talking about a little lady that is going on an adventure, but we go on an adventure together with my friends and colleagues from KPMG that will dive into the different aspects of DORA together with me today. So I'll give the word and hand it over to Augustinus for the introduction.
Yes, nice to meet you all. I'm Augustinus Mohn. I work for KPMG in the cybersecurity world, leading our business continuity management service. That means I specialize in digital operational resilience, but also non-digital operational resilience, everything around continuity, physical security, but also cyber.
Ali?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ali Alam. I work at KPMG Netherlands. I'm an IT risk management advisory professional. So basically, I help financial institutions with compliance assessments, implementations, and assurance work on local and European IT regulations and frameworks. So I have a lot of experience with some local frameworks here in the Netherlands, the EBA guidelines, IOPA guidelines, and basically from that capacity, part of the DORA core team at KPMG Netherlands, and along with Augustinus and some other colleagues responsible for bringing DORA to the market and creating a thought leadership around it, which this webinar is also part of.
Thank you, Ali. And lastly, Jordi.
Good afternoon, everyone. Super excited to be here. My name is Jordi van der Brekel. I'm also part of the KPMG cybersecurity team in the Netherlands. And I'm leading the team of ethical hackers that is responsible for doing all sorts of security tests like penetration testing, resilience-based testing, red teaming, cyber attack simulations. And of course, that's super relevant for DORA. So I'm very excited to tell you a little bit more about that later in this presentation.
Perfect. Thank you. So now let's dive in and let's see what it's all about. Of course, I hope you can forgive me my little joke about our cartoon friend, also called DORA. I know that all of you are here because you have at least a basic understanding of DORA. You know that this is a relevant topic. It is part of a range of actions that the EU is putting out there over the past couple of months and years. And this is also something that, of course, will keep us busy in the coming months and years. So DORA is to be seen in the same context as NIS2, as the Cyber Resilience Act, and different aspects of regulations and laws that have been published, where DORA is focusing especially on the financial sector, but not only, because it is also very much about third-party risk management, so ICT service providers in the context of the financial industry are also applicable to DORA. So what we're going to do today with the three gentlemen and with your interaction, you will see in a minute, we dive into the DORA topics. There's different areas. We look into ITC risk management, third-party risk management, operational resilience testing, incident management reporting. So we're having a look at all of these things, but also highlighting the benefits and especially the opportunities that one has by looking at DORA and bringing the organizations up to speed, which in the end is really about being resilient, which is, I think, a major shift from past considerations around security and risk management, and also helping, in order to improve the overall situation, because in the end, it is something that we need to do together. In order to get a little bit of an understanding of where you are in that context and what's your thought on this, let me fire out the first poll that you're gonna see now. So you have 5 questions, and really just a shoot from the hip in terms of what do you consider key challenges. You're gonna have 2-3 minutes to answer them, and we'll look at the results in a second. So really, I mean, I think the first part that we should look into is what is DORA and who does it apply to, right? And now when we're looking a little bit of the first answers that are flying in, you can see here, okay, so there's insufficient knowledge within the organization to implement DORA. I think that's not surprising given that this is a relatively new topic. It's one of the reasons why we're here today, to see if we can provide a little bit more insights. And then I see also here there's answers around the lack of technical solutions. I think that's a very interesting conversation in general around compliance, resiliency, and security, and also the other areas. We see there is a good spread. I'm a little bit surprised about some of the answers, but let's look into this together with Ali and see on what him and Jordi and Agustinus think about this. So Ali, if we now look at the results, and I hope there is some more flying in. I'm just looking back and forth to see that we don't miss anything. Is this in line with what you're seeing out there? I think probably in touch with many other organizations.
Well, looking at the results at a first glance, I must say there's a good division between the answers. So I'm not surprised. It matches reality to quite some extent. Basically, what I see among my clients, but also financial institutions in general, is that first of all, a lot of companies think they have it in order, therefore it does not pop up on their list of priorities, which is basically the last answer, which is still accounts for 13%, which is quite a lot. Basically, it's caused by the fact that when you look at DORA, the topic names have a lot of similarities with earlier regulations on EBA level, but also local level in different countries. And from there on, the mistaken choice is basically made like, oh, IC risk management, we have this process in place and everything is going to be fine. Whereas they're actually kind of mistaken. So I get the understanding, I get the flow of how this goes. But whenever I see this, I tend to tell the clients or the people I'm talking to, like, hey, don't be mistaken. You really need to do something about this. At the same time, the second point is also, which also reflects from the answers, is the struggle to implement something as DORA. I see that in the answers. It's a resource question. It's a knowledge question, also capabilities, and also lack of maturity. So I do see that in the market as well. You have companies and institutions that struggle in general. They have the internal control mindset, but when it comes to implementing, they take a lot of time and effort. And even if they manage to do the implementation correctly, they have challenges in sustaining it over time, which basically brings them back at square one, and sometimes in worst cases also under scrutinized oversight. So again, very valid what I'm seeing in the results. And lastly, the same struggle aspects that we see in the poll also apply to the new entrants, as I call them. DORA also brings in new segments within the financial sector, such as trading firms, crypto asset companies, crowdfunding platforms, so on and so further. And they do not really have that internal control mindset and really need to start from scratch. Where they will always hit all these points that are mentioned for the first 5 points on budget, knowledge, resources. So it's very well in line with my reality, so to say.
No, thanks for that. That's good to hear that. I mean, at least there seems to be a consensus in terms of what are the challenges. So if you want to briefly summarize what you think are the biggest challenges around DORA, but aside from challenges, I think there's always probably also opportunities. We also need to see that we look positively at these kind of challenges. What's your take on that, Ali?
Definitely. Challenges, opportunities both apply here, but let's start off with the challenges first. Overall, the biggest challenge, irrespective of where you are in the financial sector, what your journey is, what your maturity is, if you look at DORA, there are quite some requirements. There are maybe 6 chapters, but each of them has a lot of requirements which are pretty much in depth. And if you basically add depth against quantity, you still have a lot to account for, even if you're mature as an institution and you're part of a mature segment such as a bank or an insurance company. So that, first of all, set ahead. I already mentioned a moment ago, the new entrants, they do not have that internal control mindset. They don't have the resourcing. They don't have the knowledge. They really need to start from scratch. So that's a challenge specific to them. When I look at the more mature or institutions that have that internal control mindset, specifically looking at DORA, third-party risk management is the main challenge. I'm sure the participants will agree with me to quite some extent that when you look at third parties, a lot of the focus is what currently is happening. So if you have good relations with a company, are they delivering accordingly? Are they reporting accordingly? If there are any issues, do they follow up timely? There's a lot of focus on how things are now. But DORA will require you to look at the full life cycle of third parties, not only what's happening now. And that means that if you have a good relationship today, you should be thinking about the fact that what if I have a conflict with this party? What if they discontinue their services due to a collapse or some kind of other incident? Am I able to sustain my business operations in a efficient and effective manner without them? And that's something that's a lot of the time forgotten, basically in the sense of like, hey, when that situation will arise, we'll look into it. But by that time, it's pretty much too late. So third-party risk management, biggest challenge. But then, of course, opportunities are there as well. Again, in the participants, I'm sure there are companies that operate on different segments within the financial sector. You have companies that have banking activities, insurance products, asset management services. And till DORA, the drawback of this was that you operate in different segments. You have different European supervisory authorities. Each of them has their own guidelines, frameworks, regulations, which in the end overlap a lot over the segments. But because they're distinctive frameworks, you need to do the effort 2-3 times, basically the same resources, knowledge, effort, time on actually the same topics. So DORA basically provides a level playing field for such kind of organizations that they can apply one framework over the whole segment of their company. Each segment has the same directed effort, directed resources, and you solve it for all of your business line in 1 or maybe 2 goes at most. So that's a big opportunity. Also, often overlooked though, compliance is a very big driver, but being operationally resilient has benefits on its own as well. Think of financial strength, economic power, market benefits. Of course, if you have the reputation of being operationally resilient, that also exuberates back to the market, providing trust to current clients, but also potential clients, giving opportunities for growth, and also having a sustainable outlook towards the market, and also providing a certain sense of security. So, which is also overlooked a lot of times, very compliance driven, but do think of this, that in the end, on a longer term, you can have these benefits as well if you put in the effort and time today.
Cool, thank you. So you mentioned that there's different dimensions, and we'll look into this into more detail in a bit. I think also, I mean, you highlighted the challenge around third-party risk management. Also, from my personal point of view, I mean, this is really the area that is quite a challenge. Also beyond the financial sector, I think everyone that is working within the field is trying to get a grasp of how to manage this. And if we see, I think the first wake-up call is already some years ago with something like the NotPetya incident. There was other things that are popping up. Then, of course, in context of the COVID crisis, supply chain and everything became much more present. So I think this is really something that to remind ourselves that within the digital world that we're living, everything is interconnected. So third-party risk management is really key in that context. So looking into this, and I mean, we're talking about the regulation directive. As I said, in a bit, we'll talk about those different dimensions. What is it in terms of timeline, or what is it that we need to do now? Can you just maybe elaborate a little bit on these requirements around DORA?
Yes. Definitely. As you already mentioned, and also on the screen, it's visible, there are 6 chapters within DORA targeting a specific domain on its own. Basically, all of these will be indeed discussed later in this webinar. But just to start off from a higher level point of view, as I always put it, DORA comes in with a principle of, as I call it, something new, something borrowed. Whereas they basically try to take existing practices, standards, way of processing as much as possible and try to add new elements or new topics to it. For instance, if you look at IC risk management, a lot of that is based on what is existing, but they add new elements to it. They also add new topics such as information sharing between financial institutions. That's something entirely new. And at the same time, if you look at the regulatory text, it's the question that you basically have after reading it, like, hey, I know what to do, but how should I be doing? And that's where the timeline comes in. Currently at this point, we still have like 1.5 years of the implementation timeline for DORA. Exactly, that's the slide. And there are 2 milestones. Basically, this year, we're currently in the middle of it, where the first batch of regulatory technical standards will be published, which basically for these topics actually explain like what is actually the case and how you should be applying the what and how to implement the what that is defined in the regulatory text. So basically these will give you the explanation underlying all those requirements, how you need to be doing it. So this first batch will be published end of this year, beginning of next year, and then next year, mid next year, we will have the second and the last batch. We will give the final insight in the how. And what is also interesting about DORA is the fact that it extends the regulatory scope in 2 ways. First of all, it brings in new segments which were not really regulated from a cyber information security resilience point of view. Think of like trading firms, crypto asset providers, credit rating agencies. Actually, all of these use IT a lot and basically have cyber risks, but they were never regulated. So that's one element. But where DORA really pushes it, in my opinion, is including critical ICT third-party service providers into their scope. So think of like an Amazon, a Microsoft, a Google, but even local players within each country. You might ask the question like, hey, these are not financial institutions, so what's actually the relevance? While I get that question, at the same time, it's not that weird actually that these parties are taken into scope, because let's just think out loud. If you will think of an Amazon or a Microsoft, you can name many financial institutions that make use of services of these parties. And let's think about the fact, if an Amazon or a Microsoft somehow collapses tomorrow, it will take a lot of financial institutions along in their fall, because the amount of servicing that they do for the financial sector is huge. And there's a big chance that if they collapse, a lot of financial institutions are not able to deliver the services as they used to. And basically, most probably that will be then the next financial crisis. It will not be about money anymore like 15 years ago, but technically about information and information security. So that's an all over on a higher level what DORA brings to the table and why it comes to the table, because I can imagine there are a lot of overlapping elements to it.
Perfect, thank you. I especially liked your examples around Microsoft or other big ICT service providers. I think that's definitely something where we need to also take a step back and think about, hey, do we maybe, have we actually really looked into all of the possibilities in terms of them being available or not available? I remember also from the past, always conversations like, yes, we have a cloud service provider, SaaS provider, they're always there, we can rely on them. But we've also seen examples already of smaller glitches because this is a complex system in itself as well. So a 100% availability is really something that you would want to challenge within your risk assessments. So that without going too much into detail, again, thanks Ali, I think, for the introduction. We have now shown you guys what's the timelines, what is it that we're talking about, but of course we want to get a little bit more to the gist of it. But before getting there, we also are, again, a little bit curious in terms of what do you see is the management support within your organization. As always with these kind of things, I mean, top-down support is important, is key. It's not the only thing that you need, but if you can take the time and just say, okay, look, okay, what's the matter in our state and how does it look us? I think that would be good. So I'll give you 2-3 minutes to do this. Think about it a little bit easier this time, only 3 options. While you think about the answers and providing to this, we're going to look into what we heard before, one of the chapters. We're going to start off with the ICT and cyber risk management for your own company, but also for third parties. And I'm very happy to have Augustinus that will look into this with us in a second. But before that, let's see if we already have in some results. And you can see we have a very overwhelmingly support and understanding of DORA on the leadership. There's probably reasons for that. Let's see if we figure this out in the coming minutes. But still, there's also a few of you that say, okay, this is a very local initiative that is still driven within a certain area of the company. Also, not surprisingly, from my point of view, what's your take on this, Augustinus? And in general, I mean, when we're looking into this risk management aspects, so what is it that is required? And also here, challenges. It's nice to know the challenges, but are there any opportunities when looking just and doing the investment in this context? Oops, sorry.
Yes, I must say I'm personally a bit surprised about the results, but I'm very happy to see them, of course, because seeing such a strong support within organizational leadership for DORA is, of course, exactly what's required. It's not only a requirement of DORA itself that digital operational resilience needs to be owned at the top level of an organization. That's a compliance requirement. But of course, also in order to really have an effective operational resilience program, you need that management support. So seeing that here, that basically almost 3/4 of the participants here in this call say that their organizational leadership really supports the implementation of DORA, it's great to hear. The second most answered option, namely that it's a local initiative from probably an IT team or compliance team, that is also what we sometimes see at our clients. And it's also no surprise because DORA as a topic naturally probably falls within a lot in organizations, either into the legal compliance team or indeed into the IT/cybersecurity team, who first hear about this, pick this up, and then try to gain organizational support. The problem here with this is, of course, that this will not make you successful in becoming a resilient organization. And this is also what DORA is trying to achieve, and also what we, or I personally also would advocate for, that in order to have an effective resilience program, you do need cross-functional collaboration. So it's not sufficient to look at, for example, cybersecurity plus IT continuity plus legal and compliance or communications with your clients. You need to work together. And this is also a point that DORA makes. You need to work together. You need to establish cross-functional teams, for example, crisis management functions, but you also need, for example, a review function such as an internal audit team that looks at resilience across the organization. So each has to play their part, each function, but the key to success lies in collaboration. So I'm really happy to see that that support apparently is given in a lot of our participants' organizations. What's the challenge and where are the opportunities? In terms of challenges, it clearly is learning to speak each other's languages. This is what we sometimes see, that cybersecurity may talk a different language than a compliance team or a public relations or marketing team even, but they need to pull on one string together. In terms of opportunities, of course, as Ali already mentioned at the beginning, this is a chance to professionalize your resilience as an organization. A lot of things that are mentioned in DORA are indeed borrowed, so something old, but there's also something new. And we must not forget that DORA is an attempt from the EU to harmonize digital operational resilience requirements across the EU. So that could mean that you're either in a sector or a country where a lot of the requirements in DORA are actually something that you're very familiar with, that are easy for you to, gear up a notch and become compliant with DORA and reap the benefits. But you may also find yourself in another sector that's regulated for the first time, as Ali explained earlier, or in a country where there's generally a lower maturity of the financial sector when it comes to operational or digital operational resilience. That being said, getting the quality of your operational resilience program and the level of detail right, that is where the challenge is, but that's also where the opportunity is. You must think that you have to really professionalize your internal setup and also how you communicate with the outside world. And that does not only come down to reporting and having the right KPIs and having the right people and knowledge in the organization to pull off such a feat, but you also need to think of, for example, if you professionalize your risk management around digital risks, that you may need to think of how do you actually quantify the risks that you have. What are the potential wins and losses of the undertakings that you have as a business, your services, your products? That is a big part of DORA as well, because you will need to report on costs and losses of major incidents, for example. But of course, you also want to project that in order to justify your investment. And for this, you need to think of how you assess risk, cybersecurity risk, but also general operational continuity risk. That is what will be the main differentiator and may also give you the opportunities of such an act as DORA. And the last point on this one, maybe as a practical example, if you think of the topic of business continuity management, which is, of course, my own speciality, but also a big part in DORA, you will need to perform all the things that all the standard frameworks, such as from the Information Security Forum or NIST or ISO, will require from you in this regard. But now you really have to meet them. It's not longer optional. It's really a requirement now in the DORA. And I personally would argue that these are good requirements and that making them part of your day-to-day business operations will make you more resilient and therefore make you also stronger in the long run. I'll leave it here for now. Otherwise, I keep on talking too long and take up more time.
Thank you for that, Augustinus. I think that's super interesting. I also noticed, I have to say now that there is a little bit update in the poll, that there is 3% of the participants that says that the leadership doesn't think that DORA is a priority. I think that's still something to note, although small. But I was actually thinking, okay, no, this is definitely on the agenda, one way or the other. Maybe something we can look and dive into within the context of questions to highlight this. So what I understand and what I liked of what you were saying is that we're talking about resilience being something, working together, breaking down the silos and really thinking about an organization as a muscle, that needs to actually work together, that needs to get trained. And I think looking at historically on how security is working, but also, when you have the different approaches to risk management with the 3 lines model, in terms of your governance, this is really something that is for me a major shift in this, what is needed. But not surprisingly, because that is very much also what digital is all about. it's working together, having a mesh of different information, data, people, and organizations. So I think that's super exciting. And then it was just a small sentence. You were talking about quantitative risk analysis. I think that's also something that I noted that you highlighted there, where I also believe that this is not yet on many people's agenda to shift away from, especially in the security context, where you tend to look more on the qualitative risk analysis versus a quantitative one. I think that's definitely something interesting to look into. And also on a personal note, I think this is where you can have much different discussions and conversations with your peers on different levels, because that definitely is a game changer. So moving on, now we talked about, okay, we need to do proper risk management, we need to understanding what's our risk exposure and so on and so forth. There's other parts that in general are also always important and sometimes maybe more than only sometimes underrepresented. So there's the topic of digital operational resilience testing. So you need to take a breath because it's a very long and complex topic, but I'm pretty sure we can give you a little bit of an insight on what is behind this. And for this, I actually want to give the word to Jordi. And that's, I invite to tell us a little bit about more what is behind this. What is behind this in general, and what is behind this in context of DORA. And you as an expert can probably shed some light and help us to understand what is it that we need to do.
Of course. So like we've heard before, there's a lot of controls and a lot of measures that an organization can take to become more digital resilient. But of course, the proof is in the pudding. How do you know that you have successfully implemented all these measures and controls? And how do you know that you're effectively becoming more resilient? Well, there's only really one good way to do this, and that is by actually testing it in a realistic way. And this is also included in the DORA Act. And that is what makes it a very powerful act, I think. So the good news is that all the requirements for testing are not something crazy new. So basically, there's a couple of requirements. There's 4 articles about the digital operational resilience testing, and they're not crazy new. So the first one is that there needs to be a resilience testing program integrated in risk management. So this program needs to be risk-based, which means that you don't need to test everything all the time, but you need to make smart decisions based on risks, on risk analysis, based on threats to really determine what am I going to test, when am I going to test it, and how am I going to test it. This is, of course, not very new idea. So the second article that describes the kinds of tests that an organization is supposed to do. So this is where it gets a little bit more interesting, because it's not only about penetration testing or security testing. This article really tells you that you need to do a whole variety of different tests. For example, vulnerability assessments, the normal penetration tests, but also physical security reviews. So you need to test the physical security of your building. You need to do network security assessments. You need to do analysis on your open source tools. You need to do source code reviews on the source code that you're creating. You need to do scenario-based testing, and even end-to-end testing. And that's what makes this really interesting and really powerful, because as part of this program, you should really be defining, for example, if a team is trying to launch an application into production, what is the kind of test that needs to take place before we can actually go live with this? For example, if you create your own application, it could be that you want to do a source code review and a pen test. But if you want to do some other things in your organization, then probably other kinds of tests are better suited to that. And so this DORA really requires you to think about that upfront. And that's also what makes it really powerful, because it basically forces you to implement all these testing programs and tests into your processes, which makes it very easy to implement into your business processes, which means that it will be less ad hoc and there will be less surprises in the organization, because an organization can know upfront what kind of tests are coming their way. Another very interesting aspect in this resilience-based testing is the threat-led penetration testing article, Article 26. This is a very special type of resilience test, because with these tests, the scope is always the whole organization. So it's not an IT system, it's not an environment, it's the whole organization. The focus of these threat-led penetration testing is always on critical functions. So these are the very important functions that an organization has. For example, paying bills, keeping personal information safe, the really business, the business functions that an organization does. These threat-led penetration testing, this has to be a very realistic type of test, which also means that the test has to be performed on production systems. And that makes it very interesting because a lot of the security tests can be performed on the acceptance environments or maybe even the development environments. But these tests are, and because the scope is the whole organization, they should be performed on the production systems. Another interesting aspect is that DORA says that third-party service providers that are important to the critical function of an organization should be included in the scope as well, which means that if your organization has a critical business function which relies on the services of a third party, DORA actually requires this third-party service provider to be part of the test because it is, of course, important to the critical function. So if this third-party service would not be available, then the organization also has a problem with their critical function. And the last article, 27, is basically some additional requirements to the testers. And it basically says that the testers that do these kinds of tests, they need to be independent, they need to have the highest suitability, they need to be accredited by an authority. It does not mean that you cannot do it with internal testers, but it does mean that if you want to use internal testers, they need to be approved by an authority, they need to be accredited, and you need to prove that they can do their work independently. So like I said before, all these things, it's nothing crazy new. A lot of organizations have testing programs, a lot of organizations do pen tests, and some organizations are doing threat intelligence-based red teaming, threat-led penetration testing already. So if you look at it from that way, it is not very new. But what is important to mention is that compliancy to this DORA Act does not equal resilience. You can probably do all these things, be compliant on paper, but still not have a resilient organization. And so it's good to not only look at the challenges, but really look at the opportunities as well, because this is the perfect opportunity to really embed and integrate security testing into your organization. You can really now use a risk-based approach, draft the program, and make it clear to the whole organization what is expected from everyone in terms of testing. And so there will be a lot less ad hoc testing, a lot less surprises, and you can even create a full testing roadmap for 1 year or maybe even 3 years to know upfront what is going to happen. Another really good thing is that this act is like a conversation starter between financial entities and their third-party service providers. Because these third-party service providers need to be included in the scope of these tests, this is an excellent opportunity to have these discussions because sometimes it's not always easy to do a resilience test on both the financial entity and the service provider. So hopefully this DORA Act will make it a little bit easier. So another important thing to mention is that the DORA is really aimed at harmonizing the requirements across the European Union. So you should really see these articles, these resilient-based testing as the bare minimum that an organization should do. For example, red teaming is not a requirement that is defined in the DORA, which means that you could do all these tests focused only on preventive measures. But if you're looking at operational resilience and digital resilience, usually organizations look at preventive measures, but also detective measures and responsive measures. Because if you look from an attacker's point of view, you not only want to be able to prevent an attacker from getting into your organization, but you also want to be able to detect this attacker. And ideally, if you have detected the attacker, you of course would also like to be able to respond to that and kick the attacker out of your network. So an excellent way of doing this is red teaming. And red teaming, these are cyber attack simulations that have the most realistic angle. So for red teamings, organizations also should generally not be aware that a test is going on because you're really testing the detective and responsive measures. And of course, if an organization knows that it's being tested in a simulation, they will probably respond differently to the test than when they think it's a real attack. So this is also nothing new to the financial sector. We have the TIBER framework, threat intelligence-based ethical red teaming framework from the DNB, and that is actually a very excellent combination to have with this DORA Act. You can use TIBER tests as being the resilience-based testing that you need to do, the threat-led penetration testing, and that way, if you combine these, you are not only compliant on paper, but you are really testing the resilience of your organization with testing the preventive measures, detective measures, and responsive measures.
Super cool. Thank you, Jordi. I can really tell that this is really something that is close to your heart. The testing part. Also, I think what I heard and what I liked is that this is really something where we need to move away from a pure technical view on testing. Traditional penetration tests that look, as you said, on a system level or web application level for vulnerabilities is not what is needed to achieve resilience. Resilience is about the organization as a whole. It includes processes, it includes obviously technology, but it needs to be seen as the system it is, and this needs to be tested. It needs to be pressure tested in a context. And yes, of course, we all know the live environment is still different than the prod and pre-prod environment. So, and especially when it comes then to the organizational level and the processes, this is really something that we need to look into. And after all, resilience means also to withstand an attack, withstand the problem. So testing this and may actually get some hiccups in these things is, again, a testing and a step forward to become more resilient as an organization. But you also mentioned third parties and extending the scope to it. And this just reminds me that maybe Augustinus, if for me, this is also part of that larger risk management picture. Third parties, how do I include this? Is that maybe where you have something quick and short to add?
Yes, indeed. And I see there's also actually some questions on third parties coming in. One indeed being that how do we include third parties in the testing? And do we only have to include critical ones? And another one being on third parties, how do you actually get assurance that they are resilient? So this also comes down to testing, of course, and auditing, perhaps. What's really important to understand here, it's always been good practice to include your critical service providers in your testing approaches, or make sure that you get assurance on how resilient they themselves are, or audit them even if you have the capacity for that. That's, of course, often a problem. But DORA indeed requires that you anchor, for example, the right to audit, the right for assurance and inspections in your contracts with your third-party service providers. So they're obligated under law to provide you with that information when you conclude your contracts, as are you obligated to include that in the contracts with your providers. But apart from that, and I think that's a really important point that we did not touch upon yet, the EU itself also makes this, well, putting it in very bad terms now, power grab on critical ICT service providers by including them in the scope and actually also establishing an oversight function. So critical service providers, the really big ones, they will be identified, they will be supervised, and they will also be inspected by competent authorities. So that can mean that even if you are not capable as a business yourself to obtain assurance over the resilience of your service providers, there is another angle where the EU takes general care of that, or national competent authorities, by holding these critical service providers accountable that you may be using. So that gives you another form of assurance.
Cool. Thank you, Augustinus. Let's see. Conscious of time, also that we move on. So we talked about the risk management. We heard a little bit about how this extends to third parties. We looked into what is digital operational resilience testing. But there is one other aspect. It's like, okay, this is all inward folk, right? We gain visibility, we gain data, we get an understanding what's our exposure, we get an understanding on how good the organization acts and behaves in the context. But then when it comes to an actual incident, what is DORA actually covering in this context? So incident reporting and compliance around this is the next topic. And I'll want to give the word to you, Ali, as an auditor. What can you tell us about the requirements in incident management and reporting?
Well, the goal for the ICT incident management reporting and compliance. It's basically about strengthening your current processes. Again, that's something new, something borrowed, comes back here again. Again, because DORA's main objective is harmonization along the European continent, basically, the requirements that come out of this are basically about harmonizing. So it's twofold. First of all, it requires classification of your incidents according to classification KPIs based on DORA. So they're like sixfold. I won't go into the details now, but they're sixfold, and basically they need to be implemented in the processes of every financial institution. This basically relates to the fact that DORA also requires reporting on major ICT incidents, and these classification requirements form the basis for that. If you hit a certain combination of classification requirements into an incident, that might result into a major ICT incident, and you should be reporting about that. Again, if we put back the element of harmonization, it's really about the level playing field created through these classification requirements and reporting requirements, which basically will provide input to the regulator on a local level, and at the end to the supervisory authorities, the ESMA, IOPA, and the EBA. They will collect and assimilate all the information on these incidents and basically give it back to all the financial institutions, so they can also use that as input for the risk management processes as part of the statistics, patterns, trends, instead of just being asking information for information. So again, because you use common factors, common information, you can also use that and say something about the European landscape as a whole.
Cool. Interesting. So that I guess that is that for those more technical amongst you guys, that leans towards MISP and threat intelligence exchanges. Then within the financial context, I mean, there is the FS-ISAC that does similar things. But here we have something that is really driven by the EU and the regulators to make sure that everyone has visibility and access to this, and there's more transparency on these matters. And I think the other part, and before we go and dive into the questions, of course, we're talked about different topics like risk management, testing, incident reporting, and the compliance bit. So can we throw technology at that problem, right? I mean, this was one of the questions at the beginning, and I mean, more specifically, can we leverage artificial intelligence to demonstrate compliance with DORA? And I think at the very beginning in the poll, there was one question around resources, which also ended up in the top-rated areas. That this is always a question of resources. And from my point of view, obviously, working in the context of technology providers that put solutions out there, I think what I would say is that we need to take a step back and think about what we provide added value as risk professionals, as security professionals, and really look at ourselves and where ourselves and the team spend most of the time. And I would bet with most of you, we spend time on those areas that probably individually we love and like. There's the more techie people that like to play around with the systems. There's people that like to fill in large Excel sheets to track compliance and risks and so on and so forth. But these are all not necessarily value-adding activities. They take a lot of time and take away a lot of time from very expert and scarce resources. So there's a lot of areas within the context of risk management, governance, compliance, and also cyber, where we should look into moving away this repetitive and tedious activities into technology. Test the technology. I like the digital operational resilience testing. This is really something that needs to be also applied to your partners and providers and third parties. In this case, also means technology providers. So in that context, also I know that we always encourage our clients to actually do red teaming to test and demonstrate the advantage that solutions can bring to the table. And with this, you free up yourself and your resources to focus on what's important, which is communicating with your peers, communicating with people outside of the organization, and focusing on building resilience within your organization, which again is as much about technology. It is actually much more about processes and the organization, so the people itself. So this is where AI can help you to demonstrate compliance with DORA, because it actually helps you to focus on the right things and the right areas. So with that, I think we want to close off the topic of DORA, the introduction to all of the different areas, and we wanted to use the last couple of minutes to dive a little bit into questions that you guys raised so far. We've seen there is a few that came in. Still fire some questions. We pick out those ones that we believe provide a good benefit for everyone around theirs. So apart from Vectra, we have KPMG people here. I think this is also something to highlight again, that obviously we have them here because they do have the expertise in the respective areas around testing, audits, also in quantitative risk management. But being not the expert on this, Augustinus, what's KPMG's take on this quantitative risk management, or this the qualitative one? And what do you do around that?
Yeah, sure. I mentioned it, and now I have to explain it. I want to say here, in terms of cyber risk quantification specifically, but also operational risk quantification, that's always been a big challenge for companies, for businesses, but also for insurance companies. But of course, over the last couple of years, this has become so important that also the measures have matured quite a bit. So we see insurance companies now trying to quantify specific cybersecurity risks, for example, to be able to make a decision on whether they insure certain risks of organizations or not. On the other hand, as an organization yourself, you have a big advantage if you're able to quantify your relevant risks in that area, because that allows you to make a decision if a specific risk is within your risk appetite, or if you want to insure it, if you can insure it. This is where we come in as KPMG. So we can support that risk quantification, and we do that by scenario modeling. So we have defined a long list of different scenarios. Taking one example, for example, ransomware, where we really mapped out, on the one hand, how does such a scenario evolve? We call this the kill chain. That's also a common term in cybersecurity. So from the initial investigation that an attacker may do, to planting to malware, to then moving in your network, and at the end exploiting also certain vulnerabilities, or indeed encrypting data and then asking you for ransom. In this entire process, there's different what we call measures or mechanisms that you can implement to reduce the risk along that kill chain. And this is how we then quantify that. So then we say, for example, at the beginning, it's really important to have certain preventive measures so that an attacker cannot even infiltrate your network. But once they're in, you may have detective measures that you require. And each of these measures we quantified. So we said this is a certain impact on the overall risk of ransomware that's exposing your value as an organization. So we try to really get at the granular level in the risk quantification, look at how a scenario evolves, and then check which measures you have, and then quantify what the remaining risk is. So then there can be measures that have a greater impact or lower impact, and overall they make your entire risk exposure. I personally find this a really interesting topic. That's also why I mentioned it, of course. And this is something also where you can add a lot of benefit as KPMG to clients. That's also why I enjoy it.
No, thanks for that. And I mean, also from my side, I mean, this is really something exciting, because that is also leaning towards a much more data-driven approach to risk management, security, and compliance, which also goes back to where we need a shift as professionals. I do have a question for you, Ali, and I have to admit I had to smirk a little bit, because I mean, this is also from a practitioner's or former practitioner's point of view, the question. So if you comply to DORA, do you automatically comply to NIS2, or maybe even beyond NIS2 other directives and regulations? And if so, how would that work?
Yes, well, in the case of DORA versus NIS2, just to distinguish the difference, NIS2 is basically a directive for a broader market, whereas DORA is very specific financial services sector. So making that distinction first. Secondly, when we look on a, let's say a legal level, or the way the regulatory text is framed, it basically, in DORA, there's a reference towards NIS2 in terms of the directive, and basically saying like, okay, DORA is upheld specifically for the financial services sector. And if something there like that is not there, then NIS2 applies. But in this case, DORA is basically on the same level as NIS2 for the financial sector. So if you comply to DORA, you don't have to do much on NIS2 or NIS2 in this case. So that's basically the situation at this point.
Which leads me to a follow-up question. So if you don't comply, what is it? Do you get fines? Is there warning letters? Will they publicly shame you, or how does that work?
Very important question for sure. In the DORA regulatory text and also the communication around it, there hasn't been really something explicitly said about how they will operate with non-compliance. But then again, putting existing principles on this question, DORA is a law. So if you don't comply, you're technically in a non-compliance situation with laws and regulations. So that's first. How the regulator on a local level will act is, of course, dependent what their mandate and delegated role will be. What I can only say at this point is inferring from what I personally see in the Netherlands from a regulatory point of view, from the Dutch central bank in this case, is basically that they have more of a step-by-step approach. First of all, if you don't comply, they will come around, talk to you, understand why you can't comply, require you to put up a improvement plan, monitor that, communicate. If even after that you do not comply, then their oversight becomes stronger and stronger. And also the further you go, the more punishments will follow, resulting in fines. And in the end, at the end point, revocation of your banking license. But then again, all being said, this is an inference that we're making from the current oversight practices here in the Netherlands.
Yeah, so this means those 3% where the management doesn't really seem that DORA seems to be important. Maybe they should be nudged into highlighting, okay, there is something that may get painful in the future. So it's worthwhile looking at this now, until before waiting until this is getting too late. Cool. Now, thank you for that. I think on that note, I would just move on to summarize a little bit what we've learned today. So DORA is, again, not the little lady on adventure, but this is really about a harmonized framework across the EU for digital operational resilience, focused on the financial sector and ICT service providers in that context. There is a level of complexity. We saw the different chapters and areas, but after all, it is not something where we need to reinvent the wheel. There's stuff that can be looked at and reused and needs to be adapted. The big shift is really about taking on board the concept and idea of resilience, as opposed to the fortified protective approach in terms of building walls and castles and so on. And really is also providing this opportunity to rethink on how you set up your organization. I personally always like to refer to an image of, someone that is running a race. It's about stumbling, getting a scratch, but getting back up and then, moving forward, maybe limping for a couple of meters, but you get running instead of just falling flat and you never get up again. This is really what this is all about, the focus of making sure that your business keeps on running. We need to start moving now, right? Compliance is 2025, but 2025, that's right around the corner, as we know. Especially in larger organizations, changes and processes take time. So don't wait, get the race starting and get the right people involved, right? Here, KPMG is here to help, Vectra is here to help. There's others there that help you on that journey and make sure that you're up for it. And on that note, as I said, Go out there, build your resilience, test, 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 and make sure that that you're up for what is coming. And in order to not leave you empty-handed, again, there is additional resources that you can find in your interface, but you can also download from the website. I've listed it here, different DORA best practice guides and information around this. Also in this too, it came up in a question around that. And last but not least, a thank you from my side. A thank you to Augustinus, Ali, and Jordi for their insightful comments and details around DORA. Thank you very much. I learned a lot, and I can go back to my kids and say, hey, this is actually something equally interesting. Let's look at this together and see on how we can actually make the world a fairer, better, and safer place. On that note, have a nice one. Good afternoon. Bye.